Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the afternoon session of our conference, and thank you to the speakers this morning for such wonderful, scintillating presentations. So we move now to Dr. Brami, who is here from the University of Mainz, where he's currently a Marie Curie Fellow. Maxime, actually, though, although he's in Mainz, we can almost say is a British product. He studied at the University of Liverpool, and at the University of Bristol, where he's done most distinguished and important work on what used to be called the Neolithic Revolution. I think that's probably enough, except to welcome him, and we'll go from there. Thank you very much.
So I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and especially David Schenkel. I would also like to say that although I'm in a paleogenetics department today, I'm an archaeologist. My current project is actually looking at ways of integrating archaeology and genetics, because there are so many issues. What I want to do in this talk is also talk about my involvement in Anatolian archaeology, because I've since 2007 been involved in various projects, including two of the projects mentioned this morning. I was, I think, 3 seasons at Anatolia, 6 seasons at Bonchuklu, and I was also working in some of the Western Anatolian sites, like Barchenayuk, Ulucak, and others. And so now I want to focus on the big picture, and I think we're now going into more speculative, maybe, but we will see. So the first thing that I want to do is talk about recent Neolithic excavations in Western Anatolia, and I think that will follow on quite nicely from what we heard this morning, and how they fit into questions of the spread of agriculture, in particular, into Europe. Then I want to talk about the Central Western Anatolian farming frontier, which was the topic of a workshop that we organized in 2016 as part of ICANE. And we just published the book, which is here. And if you want to have a look at it, or maybe you can pass it around, I will talk about this as well. And finally, I will take you a little bit outside of Turkey, outside of Anatolia, and I will talk about Anatolian farmers outside and their descendants in different places in Europe, to also show you how the new results in Anatolia are somehow rewriting our understanding of European prehistory. And maybe you will understand also the significance of this work for the broader picture. So when we think of the Neolithic expansion, we often see this kinds of maps. This is the latest one by one of my colleagues in Mainz, Detlef Gronnenborn, and the idea is that the main domesticates, wheat and barley, some pulses and weeds and so on, and the sheep, goat, cattle and pigs are all domesticated somewhere in Southwest Asia. And then this package of crops and domesticates actually spreads into Europe, and as you can see here, through 2 main waves. One is the Danubian route into Central Europe, and the other one is the Mediterranean route here. I often like to go back to Gordon Child, also because he was a professor here. He was the director of the Institute of Archaeology, I think from 1945 until 1956. And this is a man also who worked briefly in Turkey, in Mersin with John Garstang in southeast Turkey. Gordon Child is the one who is usually credited for coming up with this concept of a Neolithic revolution. I just want to explain what this is very briefly. It's the shift from an appropriative or an extractive economy based on hunting and gathering, and as you will see also fishing, to a productive economy based on farming and herding. So subsistence and food production is central to his definition of the Neolithic Revolution, and I think that's still one of the main definitions which is adopted especially by European specialists of the Neolithic. And as a result of this economic transition, Gordon Chad imagined that there were a number of things happening. So you had an increase in carrying capacity, so you had a sort of booms in populations with a demographic uptick, many babies. Now we know what happened to these babies because they were given to ladies at Bonchuklu. And there were also pottery and polished stone tools and sedentism. These are all things which are somehow associated with the Neolithic. And in 1950, Gordon Chad published a book called Prehistoric Migrations in Europe, in which he outlined a model for the spread of farming from the Near East into Europe, which actually postulated that there was a migration across the Anatolian rails, although he had very little evidence. And his view was mainly that it had bypassed the Anatolian Peninsula via maritime connections. And we've already heard about James Mallard. James Mallard was a student, I think, of Gordon Chad at the Institute of Archaeology. And James Mallard not only discovered and not only excavated Çatalhöyük, but before that, he also discovered another important site for Neolithic archaeology, which is Hatshila. And this site, which is located in southwest Anatolia in the Lakes district near the town of Bordeaux today. What is interesting about it is that it yielded this beautiful decorated pottery, painted pottery, which is almost identical to the pottery that we know from Neolithic Greece, from the site of Sesklo in Greece. And it also looked a bit like the Halaf pottery from northern Mesopotamia. So the site of Hatshila became a sort of missing link, I think, in grand narratives of farming expansion. Now, if you go back about 20 years, what is interesting is a lot of reconstructions of the spread of farming weren't very clear about what was happening in Western Anatolia. So when we see here this map from Professor Jean Guilaine from the Collège de France, an eminent Neolithic specialist, there was almost nothing. I think the Eastern Marmara region, there was already excavations at the site of Ilipina, but as you can see, it's basically a blank space here. Western Anatolia is mostly a blank space. Another reconstruction by Professor Bar Youssef from Harvard University from about the same period actually postulated that Western Anatolia was part of the PPNB interaction sphere, which we know is not the case. But both of them were actually based on very little empirical data. And there are other maps. There's also a map by, I think, Professor Mehmet Özdoğan, which actually showed a big question mark on Western Anatolia. So about 20 years ago, despite excavations at Hatshila, and despite already excavations at Ilipina and some other finds at Fikirtepe, Western Anatolia was very much a question mark. Now, these are the location of the sites that I've mentioned before, Hatshila, Çatalhöyük, and Sesklo. And you can see here some of the location of some of the main sites that have been excavated since the last 20 years. They've produced, I think, remarkable results. Most of them actually, the excavations are already complete. Some of them are still being excavated, like there's a very nice site called Ekşehöyük, which is not far from Denizli, which is still under excavation. But I think we will see a lot more publications in the next couple of years for this region. It's very hard, I think, to convey to an audience how exciting it is and how exciting it was to work on this project. I just want to show some of the sites that were excavated in parallel, both in Central Anatolia and Western Anatolia at the same time. So you've heard of Çatalhöyük and Bonchuklu, but you see also here pictures from the site of Barçinhöyük in northwest Anatolia, the site of Çukuritçi, which is near Ephesus, or the site of Aktopraklik and Ulucak. And you see at Ulucak a very deep stratigraphy. So where do these new sites fit into the broader picture? So as I said, in 2016, we, together with my colleagues from the Austrian Academy of Sciences, we organized a workshop at the Cannes conference and we invited people from working in Central Anatolia, archaeologists working in Central Anatolia, and archaeologists working in Western Anatolia. We asked them to actually come together and discuss new evidence and how they relate to one another. And what is interesting is that Western Anatolia, what we know of the Neolithic of Western Anatolia, is that it started quite late compared to what we heard, for instance, this morning. So instead of a site like Bonchuklu, where we have evidence for low-level food production already from the end of the 9th millennium BC, in Western Anatolia we don't have evidence for food production. We don't have evidence for a Neolithic economy before about 6,600 BC. There's been quite a lot of work on radiocarbonates. Quite a lot of radiocarbonates have been produced from these new sites that you see here in Western Anatolia. And especially through the work also of Leclerc and Bernard Weniger, it was clear that that 6,600, maybe 6,700 BC was the start for many of these farming societies in Western Anatolia. So I show you here, for instance, the sun probability distributions of the radiocarbon that we have. I don't know if it includes all of them. I think some of them are still missing for Central Anatolia. But you can see quite remarkable picture here. So when you pool all the dates, some people interpret this as demographic proxies. I'm a bit careful because I think the ups and downs are also reflecting the wiggles in the calibration curve and so on. But still, what you can see is for Central Anatolia, these are radiocarbon dates associated with food-producing sites or food-producing levels. I think we can say that the Neolithic, even though it might still be low-level food production, we have evidence for domesticates all the way back to the 9th millennium BC. In Western Anatolia, we don't have anything like this before about 7,000, or as I said, 6,600 BC might be the start here. So we are dealing with a massive chronological lag in the uptake of the Neolithic. What is, for me, also very striking is that in Greece, the early Neolithic sites of Greece have produced very similar distributions of radiocarbon dates when you compare with Western Anatolia. So it looks like both sides of the Aegean basin where they became, they adopted agriculture at the same, more or less at the same time. And then it took another 500 years for farming to spread further into the Balkans north of the Aegean basin, as you can see here. And there's a wonderful site in northwest Anatolia on the border with Bulgaria called Ashapina, which fits really nicely with this horizon. People who have worked at continental level and collected tons of radiocarbon dates, like Michel Ras, for instance, in France, they've come up with this really wonderful maps, where you can see how Central Anatolia might still be part of the Near East, let's say, for the Neolithic, or distantly part of the Near East, whereas Western Anatolia is already a different world. It's already part of the European expansion of that Neolithic, with periods of like rapid advance, and then periods where the Neolithic just stops, and sometimes for hundreds or thousands of years. So as I said, we published these books, and I think what was interesting from organizing this workshop was that the authors that we invited came up with very different reasons for why we had this lag. Professor Douglas Baird, for instance, suggested that in Western Anatolia we just haven't found the sites, and I think that is a valid possibility. We had other people who were more optimistic, who said, all the sites are more or less from the same horizon. They appear around 6,600 BC, and they're very elaborate Neolithic sites with everything present from the beginning. So it looks like a delayed start in Western Anatolia. And potentially it's interesting, because that would mean that at the same time as we have farmers in Central Anatolia, we still have foragers in Western Anatolia. I think that is one distinct possibility, although we still don't really know what is happening in the 9th and the 8th millennia in Western Anatolia. Just to show you another way of looking at things, in Central Anatolia we've already heard from the previous speakers that different components associated with the Neolithic, as defined by Gordonschild and others, they appear gradually. So there is a sort of developmental long-term trajectory. Whereas in Western Anatolia, with the exception of polished stone tools, which are already present in the 9th millennium and even the 10th millennium, at Cusini and some of the caves in the Antalya region, all the other elements, they seem to appear more or less at the same time. So with the first farming communities have a sort of package with everything already in there from the beginning. And that's an interesting contrast between Central and Western Anatolia. And some of the things in Western Anatolia, like 4-tiered animal husbandry, that means here sheep, goat, cattle and pigs, these 4 species of domestic animals, we actually don't see them on the Central Anatolian plateau. Whereas in Western Anatolia, we have them from the beginning of the Neolithic. I think that's very interesting. Also from the work of people who worked with chipstones, Marina Milic, for instance, she published this nice map which shows that there are parallel networks for the sourcing of obsidian. So most of the obsidian from Central Anatolia comes from the Cappadocian sources, whereas most of the obsidian from the Aegean sides, both from the Mesolithic and the Neolithic period, they come from the island of Melos. And increasingly through the work of Tristan Carter, Bogdana Milic, it also looks like there were different industries in Central and Western Anatolia at the same time. So we had a sort of flake-based industry in the Aegean, while at the same time in Central Anatolia we had this pressure blades from Caletipe and so on. And then around 6,600 BC, when we see the first advent of agriculture, then we see pressure blades also appearing in the Aegean. And here you see an example, a beautiful cache from the side of Çukurriçi Höyük, which is somewhere here. So they date to the 7th millennium. And what is interesting is that they continue to make both pressure blades and these flake-based industries at the same time, but they are all produced on this obsidian, or most of them are produced on this obsidian from Melos. So even once the so-called Central Western Anatolian farming frontier is breached, there are still different networks and different differences between Central and Western Anatolia. When we look at habitation, we see some interesting things as well. I mean, this is a slightly later site from Western Anatolia, northwestern Anatolia, the site of Aktopraklik near Bursa, and it has a very elaborate, very distinct pattern of houses here, which are radially aligned, and that's a slightly older house from Ulucak. And what I think is very interesting is that they follow the tradition that we have in Central Anatolia of having, one big room houses. And I should say that the archaeology in Western Anatolia is quite disappointing compared to what we heard from Southeast Turkey, for instance. We don't have anything that remotely looks like a public building or a special building. So essentially we only have houses. Some of them are slightly more elaborate again, slightly bigger than others, but mostly we're just dealing with houses. We actually documented an interesting sequence of buildings at the site of Çukurriçi, again near Ephesus. You can see it here. That's what it looks like what it looked like when we excavated it, and we could only excavate a small corner of it. But you see here one building inserted inside the walls of another building. So in a way, something similar to what we heard from Lee about the Göbekli Tepe temples. But here we are thousands of years later. So, not temples, sorry. The not temples. So here we have also a not temple, but it looks like they also inserted one building inside another one, but we are thousands and thousands of years later. So it's interesting that they are doing something similar to our hunter-gatherers from Southeast Turkey. So okay, I think now you understand where Western Anatolia fits, I think, in relation to Central Anatolia. And now I want to take you a little bit away from Anatolia for a minute, just to see some of the prospect also for European prehistory. And for this, I have to mention the work of my research group in Mainz. Professor Joachim Burger, he coordinated a study in 2009 already, which based on mitochondrial DNA of paleogenomes from Central Europe. It could show some clear discontinuity between the final Holocene hunter-gatherers in Central Europe and the first farmers. And that was one of the first indications, I think, that probably there were people migrating into Central Europe, spreading farming. And that solved a lot of discussions at the time, which were still revolving around was farming adopted by indigenous communities, or was farming spread by migrating farmers. So in 2012, Joachim Burger organized a network, an international network called the BEAM Project, Bridging the European and Anatolian Neolithic, which was trying to follow this trail of ancestry and see what we have for Western Anatolia, for Southeast Europe. And that involved a number of international partners, including, I think, Ian Hodder. And one of the important studies that was published as part of it was this paper in PNAS in 2016, where they didn't just study mitochondrial DNA, but they also studied nuclear DNA, and they did this whole genome sequencing. So they got a lot more information, and what they could show is, based on the discoveries at Barchineliuk in northwest Anatolia near the Iznik Lake, they could show that the first farmers from Central Europe genetically were very close to our first farmers from northwest Anatolia. So it looked like the trail of ancestry was going all the way back to northwest Anatolia. I want to show you one region where this is especially important, and that's a region which is really well known, I think, archaeologically, called the Danube Gorges, or the Iron Gates Mesolithic. And you might have heard of the site of Lepenskivir, which was excavated in the 1960s by Dragoslav Strejolic. And this site, another site in the region, which is on the border between Serbia and Romania today, this site has some very interesting evidence of hunter-gatherers slash fishers that were sedentary or semi-sedentary by the side of the Danube and exploiting the fish from the river. And when farming was introduced in the Balkans at around 6,200 BC, they started to, in the north of the Aegean, they started to, well, we start to see some subtle changes in the sequence. So we see more complex architecture. We see this elaborate huts with trapezoidal floor plans. We see burials on the floors. And around 6,000 BC, we see domesticates being introduced. And a number of teams have been working on this site quite intensively since the 1990s. Clive Bonso, Dusan Boric, and Sofia Stefanovic. And they've done a lot of analysis with stable isotopes. And I just want to show you here one of the results, which I find quite fascinating. So each of these little symbols is one individual from this region, and we have a direct date for each of them. And this is just the nitrogen isotope, but they have a lot more isotope. I just brought it together, and I thought it was quite a neat figure, because what you can see is, with the introduction of agriculture around 6,100 or 6,200 BC in the Balkans, we see a sudden drop in trophic level. So the Mesolithic from the Danube Gorges have quite high nitrogen values. So maybe they were top carnivores, or maybe they were eating a lot of fish. I think there's now some evidence that they indeed were eating a lot of fish, because fish tend to have longer food chains. So when you eat a lot of fish, you you have a lot more nitrogen. But what is interesting is around 6,200, 6,000 BC, as I said, you see these two clusters with some populations that are still have elevated nitrogen values, and other populations here which have lower ones. That's a sort of horrible fish that you can get from the Danube today. There were two genetic studies that were published on this Danube Gorges Mesolithic, Neolithic. One of them was Matthijs and al. From 2018 in Nature, and the other one was by Zuzana Hofmanova from our genetics department. I asked my colleague Johan Dickmann to make this figure for me because it's very complicated. It's actually, this is again whole genome sequencing, and they have hundreds of thousands of markers. And what they can do is they can reduce the diversity to 2 or 3 sometimes components. And basically each of these little dots is one individual. And just to explain how that works, so here you have the DNA of modern populations. So that's modern DNA from present-day Eurasian populations. And our early farmers from Balkans and also from the Greek side, that's where they cluster. So they are a little bit outside, and they look a bit like our modern-day Sardinians, which are here. And our Central European Neolithic are a little bit displaced in that direction. And then we have one individual here from a site called Lochbourg, which is today in Luxembourg, between Germany and France. And that's a representative member, let's say, of our Western hunter-gatherers. And in terms of genetic diversity, there's as much genetic diversity between today people living in Scandinavia and people living in the Near East than there is between our Western hunter-gatherers and our Anatolian Aegean early farmers. So they would have also looked quite different, probably. Now, where do our Lepenski-Vir and Danube Gorges Mesolithic people actually fit? That's interesting. So our Danube Gorges Mesolithic people fit very neatly with our individual from Lochbourg. So the Luxembourg connection. And that's interesting because they're on the Danube, and there's a lot of connection across Europe between the Danube, the Rhine, the Mosel River. So you can imagine these hunter-gatherers moving across Europe. But we have a number of individuals from Lepenski-Vir, which interestingly cluster completely outside. They are Lepenski-Vir 61, Lepenski-Vir 17, and Lepenski-Vir 54E. And they are overlapping, or they are closer to our Anatolian Aegean early farmers. So it looks like we have migrating farmers from Anatolia indeed moving to the Danube Gorges and being integrated in this hunting and gathering communities, fishing communities. And we also have one individual from the side of Padina, which looks like, it might be an outlier, but it looks like it's the first generation offspring between a Western hunter-gatherer and an Anatolian Aegean early farmer. It's very interesting. And so these are the two sites I mentioned, Lochbourg, Luxembourg, and Balkans, in northwest Anatolia, and they are from about the same time period, 6,200 to 6,000 BC. Now, if we look back at subsistence, we can start building some biographies of our early farmers. And migrating early farmers. So actually 2 of the individuals that I mentioned before, Lepenski-Vir 54E and Lepenski-Vir 17, they're both females, and they both have more of a farming signature, or it looks like they are eating terrestrial C3 plant, so they don't have such high nitrogen isotope levels. But the other 2 individuals, Lepenski-Vir 61 and Padina 4, which are somehow related also to the Anatolian trail of ancestry, they seem to be more typical fishers. In terms of burial practices, it's also interesting. So Lepenski-Vir 17, this individual, is actually buried in contracted position, like our Anatolian early farmers. But Lepenski-Vir 54E, that you can see here, is buried in extended supine position, so parallel to the Danube, which is a typical Mesolithic way of burying the dead in this region. So it's obviously very interesting to start to see these connections, and I think in the future we'll see a lot more of individual biographies, maybe of even migrating farmers and things like this from Anatolia. And I just want to finish by pointing another study from my colleagues, Mark Thomas and Johan Dickman, which I thought is a bit controversial, I think, in Britain in the context of Brexit. But you might have heard that 6,000 years ago there was a big population replacement. This is how they presented it in this paper. And that our hunter-gatherers, like Cheddarman that you see here, reconstructed as quite dark skin with blue eyes, they were apparently displaced, or they were replaced by early farmers. Because when you look at this admixture plot here, they're talking about an Anatolian Neolithic component, and you can see for parts of England we are talking about nearly 80% of Anatolian ancestry. Obviously, we are now in the 4th millennium BC, so it's much later in time. It's at another end of Europe. So I think in this case there is no indication that we have farmers directly coming from Anatolia and settling in Britain. But what it probably shows is that across Europe there is this initial wave of expansion of the Neolithic, and that we have an almost unbroken trail of ancestry that leads all the way back to Anatolia. And then I said it's not just Anatolia, it's actually both sides of the Aegean, and I think we'll have more data in the future that actually shows that both sides of the Aegean were a similar gene pool, let's say. And that's interesting because it also links up with what we heard before from Central Anatolia, because the individuals from Bonchuklu, for instance, clustered very neatly with the early farmers from northwest Anatolia. So it might be, we don't exactly know what is the extent of that original gene pool, but it's apparently spreading across different parts of Anatolia and the Aegean. So just to conclude, agricultural dispersals beyond the Anatolian plateau started around 6,600 BC. It looks like, at the moment, I'm still waiting for a big, 9th millennium or 8th millennium site to turn up with evidence of farming practices. And even once the central western Anatolian farming frontier was bridged, there were still distinct regional trajectories regarding the adoption of Neolithic practices. So in Western Anatolia, it looks like farming was adopted in a much more packaged way. That it was a mixed economy with sheep, goat, cattle, pigs, and crops, and intensive manuring that we know through the work of Amy Bogart from other parts of Europe. So it looks very much like what Trevor Watkins once called an artificial and a portable ecosystem, and that's why I put this illustration here, which has nothing to do with the Neolithic, which is like a Hindu view of the universe, because that's how I imagine our first farmers, that they came with an entire universe with them. And so early farmers from across Europe have an almost unbroken trail of ancestry leading back to northwest Anatolia, the side of Barshinu, and no doubt the Aegean basin, also the Greek side, suggesting migrations from these regions into Europe. And in the Danube gorges, we have migrating early farmers from Anatolia who had mixed with indigenous hunter-gatherers. So it's not just migration. They also, along the way, as they were migrating into Europe, they met with hunter-gatherers, and they sometimes stayed in some regions like the Danube gorges. Thank you. And with this, I want to also thank my colleagues for helping me with this. Yeah. Thanks. I was a bit over time.
No, not at all. Thank you for that absolutely fascinating overview. Do we have any questions, please, for our speaker? Please.
So can you say anything about why there is this hiatus between Central and Western Anatolia?
Yeah, it's a difficult question, because in Western Anatolia, all the Neolithic sites that have been excavated so far, they sort of start at about 6,600 BC, and some of them have been excavated to the bedrock. And it doesn't look like there is any real, there's maybe a very short aceramic Neolithic phase, but we're just missing it. So why that is, I don't know. What we know is from the Greek side, we have Mesolithic sites in the 9th and the 8th millennium, so it looks like there are still hunter-gatherers around. which is not necessarily exclusive. I mean, in parts of Europe we have evidence for hunter-gatherers and farmers living side by side, sometimes for hundreds or thousands of years. But yes, why is always a difficult question. I mean, one of the arguments that has been put before is that I think that was the original argument by Ushope, that Western Anatolia was a very different environment, was much more forested, and maybe somehow that was like a frontier or something like this for agricultural expansion. But I personally I don't know. It's the why is always difficult.
The Lipinski-Beer stable isotope evidence, have they analysed lots of the animals?
Yes, they did actually. Yes, they did analyze the fish, and yes, and they have similar signatures. You can actually, I mean, you can't see it on this illustration, I guess, but yes, there's a strong
elevated.
Yeah, there's a strong baseline. Yeah, it's not 100% sure. Like I think just from the stable isotope point of view, what I saw, I mean, I collected this data because I was quite interested, and we have partners working in these regions. It's not entirely clear just from the stable isotope point of view if they were fishers or maybe they were top carnivores. That could also be. I mean, maybe they were eating a lot of like meat and so on. But I think there's some new evidence, lipid residues in pots and so on, that suggests, I think, even maybe, I think there's some evidence that fish was actually consumed in some of the pots that were introduced at the site. Yeah.
Plant evidence from Lipinski-Beer, did you talk about that?
No, I didn't.
Because they have analysed it, haven't they?
I think so. Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't. I don't know exactly what is the situation, but I think it starts after 6000 BC. I think they have no domesticates. There's no evidence of domesticates before about 6000 BC, which is interesting. Which is quite late, I think, in the sequence. Yeah, and because it's such. It's a region which is really contained, within this elevated hills. I don't know exactly where farming would have taken place.
Or were they getting?
Maybe.
From outside, getting.
Possibly. I mean, one of the big unknowns. I mean, I'm mostly interested in Western Anatolia and the Aegean. Is this sort of studies where you can combine genetics and you can combine stable isotopes and so on. These sort of studies are still missing in Western Anatolia and in the Aegean basin. We have evidence from the side of from the side of Balkans, I think, or Ectopraklik, that we have a farming signature, but we don't know for the Mesolithic what is happening. So we don't have this sort of long-term perspective where we can really see the differences and so on. Yeah.
Cool. Can I ask you quickly, how do these fascinating dispersal narratives fit in with current nationalist origin narratives? Just very briefly, is there a great clash, or is there something? About a minute left.
I think it's always been there. Like it's never completely left, because I don't know exactly why. I mean, James Mellard went to Turkey, I guess, to look for the sea people originally, but I think probably at the back of his mind was still the Indo-European question. I think maybe Goldenscheid was certainly interested in the Indo-Europeans. So the homeland question that has been also elaborated by Colin Renfrew and others, I think has always been there. And now, in terms of nationalistic perspectives, I don't know if they can really use, or how this can be. This I don't know. I don't know what can be done with this data. But I think it's interesting that we have obviously this trail of ancestry, and that somehow, we will also have to deal with Anatolian farmers, Aegean farmers, Greek farmers, and they're probably part of the same ancestral gene pool. So I think we will have the national question will certainly come up at some point.
You see the headlines in the Turkish newspapers. You know, we got to Britain first.
Exactly. That's a nice one. Yeah. I wanted to publish it, but yeah.
As Ian mentioned earlier, controlling this stuff is impossible. So nationalists will find and pervert anything they want in any way they want.
Well, I'm so sorry. Unless there's something absolutely urgent, do you have an urgent brief point you'd like to make, as it were?
Very briefly,
please.
I mean, you at Lipinski Vir, there are signs of interaction between hunter-gatherers and incoming farmers. There's also a lot of evidence for actually displacement and conflict. I think there's a site in Germany where they made these kind of studies where Mesolithic populations were actually basically slaughtered or something. Do you have more evidence for that?
Well, it's not my evidence, but from the Danube gorges, there are a lot of burials, I think, especially from the Mesolithic, with bone arrowheads embedded in the invertebrates and things like this. But in terms of conflict, I think for the Neolithic, it's mostly the later Neolithic, I think, where we see a lot of evidence across.
Not at the beginning.
Not so much at the beginning, as far as I know. Yeah. I mean, there's a site of Herxheim in, which is one, but how do you interpret this evidence? It's like you have a ditch and you have a lot of disarticulated human bones and so on. Is it signs of conflict or what is it? I think it's still not entirely clear.
Sadly, we're out of time for this session, but we can catch up with these things later maybe. Thank you so much.